This is the 21.5 Show.
You're on 121.5, the emergency frequency.
Whether you're a professional pilot or want to be one, you're in the right place.
Let's get started.
Join professional aviators Dylan and Max as they talk their experience in the airlines, business aviation, and more.
Life is good.
Industry experts, unique stories, and plenty of fun. This is the 21.5 Show.
Here we go.
It's another episode of the 21.5 Show, the show for professional pilots by professional pilots. Hello, my name is Dylan. I'm one of your hosts. Today, we are talking to Seth Lake. He is a major airline pilot and also a DPE, Designated Pilot Examiner. Today, Seth is going to share with us what it is like to be a DPE and how it can be a possible side gig for professional pilots. Seth does an awesome job explaining the ins, the outs, the highs and the lows of being a DPE, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy this show, so let's get right to it. Max, we're so excited to have Seth Lake join us. Seth is a DPE and a pilot at Southwest Airlines, and also the host of the VSL Aviation podcast. And Seth is here to shine a light on what it's like to be a DPE, how professional pilots could look into it as a nice little side gig, and how to provide a valuable service to our career field.
Love it. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Seth.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Seth, you told us in the pre-interview, always makes me a little nervous. We gave you advice a little while ago, and we're like, oh no, hopefully things worked out. Tell us what happened.
It was about a year ago. I owned and operated a flight school when I got out of the military and was doing that full time. I was doing some Part 135 work on the side. I was a DPE and I was in the Air Force Reserve. So I had a lot of stuff going on and decided that it was too much and maybe the airlines weren't so bad. I'd been avoiding them for a few years. So
I remember this.
I do remember too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot going on. Anyway, I applied to Delta and Southwest. Those are the only two. I got invites from both. I did the Southwest interview. I love Southwest. They were my first choice. So that's where I went up, and here I am. I've been a FO there for about 8 months now.
And it's worked out?
Oh, it's worked out great. Yeah, I love Southwest. It's one of those things you just don't know what you don't know. So I had to try it because I couldn't just sit back and say, yeah, I never wanted to be an airline pilot. It's not for me. Well, how can you really say that unless you've done it? So, what do I have to lose? I've got plenty of backups. I could go do something else if I wanted, but I really enjoy the Southwest gig.
Put it here, Max. I think that's one in the win column for us. Yes, one of the few.
One of these days, though, someone would be like, I took your advice. It's completely blown up.
Yeah,
I've lost my wife.
Yeah. Living in my truck.
Living in a van down by the river.
We were worried. Good. Glad to hear it. Well, Seth, so you started kind of on the flight school side, then went to the airlines, and you're finding a way to be able to do both now. And it's a possible side gig for a lot of our listeners, right? So we'd love for you to kind of explain to us first, what is a DPE for anyone that doesn't know? And then how can our listeners maybe consider that as an option for a side income?
Sure. So that's a question that I get a lot. And that's why I think that's great for your listeners, because you have a lot of professional pilots that listen to the show. And I get asked that a lot by either coworkers in the military or Southwest or other, business aviation that I've been involved with of, hey, I'd really like to become a DPE. How does one go about doing that? And that's a really common question that I get. So first of all, what a DPE is. I think most people conceptually understand what it is, but I'll go into a little more detail about how exactly we operate, maybe offer up some analogies to help you understand it better. But DPEs are not FAA contractors and they aren't FAA employees. They're just representatives of the FAA. A good analogy would be like a notary. So a notary doesn't work for the state. They're just a representative of the state. They're given a very specific thing that they can do. They can notarize documents or whatever, and they can charge a reasonable fee for that. But they're not paid by the state or the organization they work for. Normally, they're just a representative. So that's kind of what a DPE is. We are representatives that can charge a fee for the service that we provide, and we're very limited in the types of services we can provide. That's outlined in our certificate of authority that each DPE has. So, you have DPEs that can only give the private pilot or instrument rating, for instance. And then you might have the commercial, multi-engine, ATP, CFI, all the different ratings, all the way up through type ratings. So those are very specific authorities that you may or may not have. DPEs have different levels. So like myself, I can give single engine, private, all the way through ATP and initial CFI. Interestingly, I can give type rating rides in the C-130. So if any C-130 operators out there need a type rating in that, I can do that. You know, I'm at Southwest now. I'm FO. Once I upgrade to captain and log 50 hours PIC as a captain, I could add the 7.3 to my certificate of authority, and I could issue a type rating in the 7.3. So that's how that works and how we fit into the FAA.
You can do private multi-engine as well? And
yes.
Commercial you can do all that stuff. Okay. So everything through CFI.
Yeah, I can do basically everything, the fixed wing land stuff anyway. And that's pretty common. You'll start out with maybe a private and instrument, and then as you gain experience, you can add more and more authorizations. And we'll talk about kind of where the minimum qualifications come from, how many hours you need. Because some people, when they apply, they don't have enough time and type of a multi to get the multi-engine authority. So as you gain experience in that, you could add it later on.
Got it. Okay. So is there a limit to how many DPEs there are, or do you apply? How does this all work to be able to get the position?
Yeah. You'll hear a lot of people say we have too few DPEs. There's a DPE shortage. And a lot of people complain and say, well, it's because it's a good old boy network and the FAA keeps it artificially low so DPEs can make a lot of money. That's just not the case. So DPEs are representatives of the FAA, but they're managed directly by FAA employees in their specific district or FSDO. So like I'm managed by the Little Rock FSDO. I have a managing specialist, and there's a certain ratio that there has to be. That managing specialist can only manage, let's say, 5 examiners. So if there's only 3 managing specialists that work at the Little Rock FSDO, then the Little Rock FSDO can only manage up to 15 DPEs. So the number of DPEs is limited by the number of FAA employees, kind of indirectly.
Okay.
We're in an industry right now where the airlines pay really well, the industry's doing really well, and so those federal jobs aren't being filled at the same rate that they used to be. So the FAA is struggling to keep personnel on its books because to be an FAA ASI, it's about the same minimum qualifications that I need to go to an airline. And the airlines pay a lot better. At least that's the perception, So we typically see, I think, in the industry when we see a downturn like with 9/11 or 2008 or COVID, the airlines stop hiring and everybody rushes to the government sector because that's the stable job. The FAA doesn't struggle finding ASIs then, but ASIs are hard to come by now because I have, a choice to go be a GS-12, and you can look up the pay rates for GS-12, and it's not nearly as good as a Southwest first officer. So as long as the FAA struggles to maintain those ASIs, they can't manage a bunch of DPEs. So that's one of the problems why there's so few DPEs. The other problem is there's just a lot of flight training activity right now. I think we're in a little bit of a flight training bubble, honestly. Running some rough numbers. I think if you look at the big 5 airlines, which kind of drive hiring for the industry, there's about 60 to 70,000 pilots employed by the big 5. To give you a frame of reference, there's about 91,000 certificates, and these are primary certificates that were issued in just 2021. So that's 2021. It's not counting 2022 or 2023 or 2020 for that matter. We've created probably 200,000 to 300,000 new pilots for this industry that the big 5 drives is just 62,000. So you can kind of imagine how these numbers scale.
Wow.
I think we've created a little bit of a bubble for ourselves. And, I think the FAA recognizes that. And they realize we don't need to go out and make a bunch of new examiners because the pace that we're on for flight training, I don't think is really sustainable for more than a few years.
That number is way higher than I would.
Yeah, it's interesting because nobody thinks of it down at that level, at the where it all begins, and it's just like anything else, right? When things get hot, it gets oversaturated. Yes. Everyone, wow.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
Let's go get our real estate license. No.
Yeah. 2008. Let's get a mortgage broker. Yeah.
Because there's
Wow.
a big lag there. If I could magically make you a commercial pilot today, most commercial pilots I give a checkride to have about 300 hours, let's say is the average. So I can make 1,000 commercial pilots this year that all have 300 hours. They all need to get to 1,500 hours. Well, that's going to take them a year or two to get there. So before we realize that there's a logjam, we've already created a bunch of pilots that are in this between 300 and 1,500 hours. I think there's hundreds of thousands of pilots in that zone, and they're all struggling for a finite number of jobs to build those hours. Some of them will quit and seek other careers. Some of them will keep pressing, but we've created a ton of pilots over the past few years.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And we see that in the listener emails that we get. I would say the majority of our listener emails are, I've got 1,000 to 1,500 hours and I'm having a hard time finding a job, and
yeah, that's going to be, it's like rush hour traffic, right?
Yeah.
The front cars start moving, and then when they hit the brakes, it takes a while till you're at the back of the line.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden you're slamming on the brakes too. So
this is what it is.
Well, thanks for painting that rosy picture. So why don't we
Great,
move on
Seth.
here?
Jeez.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for providing that uplifting perspective, Isaiah.
All right, Seth. So let's say that it actually does sound interesting to become a DPE, though. Our listeners are thinking about it. What are walk us through the basic qualifications? What do you need to have?
How do you apply? What's
competitive? Kind of give us the landscape here.
Sure. So I've provided you guys with some links. The 8095 Charlie, and I'll reference a couple 8000 series documents. That's what the FAA uses. Those are kind of the guidebooks for administrative stuff that happens in the FAA. So the 8095 Volume 3, Chapter 2 has all the minimum qualifications. And it has a table in there that talks about the number of hours that you need as, for different levels of designation. So just the basic one, I won't read through all of them because there's a lot of options here. But basically about 2,000 total hours PIC, 1,500 hours in airplanes, 500 in class, 100 at night, 200 in complex. And in the past 12 months, you have to have 100 hours. And that's all PIC. Then of those hours, as a flight instructor, 500 hours in airplanes, 100 hours in class that you're seeking. So that would be like single engine or multi-engine. And then you have to have 150 hours preparing airmen for commercial or ATP certificates with airplane categories. So it's pretty specific on, you need to have been an active instructor for a good portion of those hours. So you can look at the 8095 Volume 3, Chapter 2, that's where those minimum qualifications are. In addition to those flying hours, some of the other minimum qualifications that the FAA says is you need to have been a chief instructor, assistant chief instructor, or check instructor at a 141 for a minimum of 12 months. You must have served as a check airman for a 121 and 135, served as a TCE or an APD, a military instructor or examiner for at least 12 months, or served as a FAA ASI.
That narrows it down quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I hear people say, well, I've got all the hours, well, do you have those other minimum qualifications? So the first thing I tell people is that if they want to be involved, or if they want to be a DPE, they really need to get involved pretty in-depthly, whatever professional aviation organization they're in currently. So like I was a check airman for a 135 after I became a DPE, but I noticed, the incentive structure really isn't there because I don't really get paid that much extra to be a check airman, and I take on a lot more responsibility. So I think a lot of pilots are like, yeah, I'm going to pass on that. I don't want to be a check airman because,
Hypothetically speaking, if you were a check instructor and then also became a TCE, but this was 25 years ago, would that still be relevant?
Yes, it would be. There's no time limit on that. Yeah.
See? And you did that for a reason.
And you also fell asleep during a check ride.
Yeah,
and still failed a student.
Neither confirm or deny that.
That kind of gets into maybe the phase 2 of what I'll talk about today of how to build your resume and what I think would make you more competitive. But the bare minimum is you got to get involved, whatever professional aviation you're in right now, be it 141 flight training, or if you're in a 142 program, training at an airline as a line instructor, going out and seeking those responsibilities like being a check airman. Those are all kind of prerequisites to being a designee.
Okay. So there is a path, like if for our listeners right now that maybe they only instructed for a little while and then went to the airlines, there's still a path to doing it, but you got to get involved in your airlines training program first and knock out some qualifications, right?
That would make the most sense. I think for a lot of your listeners, if they're military, they can get your instructor rating. If you can become an evaluator, that all counts. Yeah, if you're at an airline and you can become a check airman, that's a great way. As a check airman, you'll be interacting with the same people you will be interacting with as a DPE if you're in the same FSDO. So like the 135 I operate out of here at Little Rock, my managing specialist for the 135 check airman is the same individual that gives my observation rides as a DPE. It's the same person often. So,
okay. So there is still a path if you weren't a super instructor like some of us back at the good old days. Listen. Okay. So if you can check the boxes or you can get on a path to check the boxes, how do you be competitive? How do you actually make yourself a good candidate?
Yeah, so if you check the boxes, you can go to the DMS website. That's the Designee Management System website. Again, gave you the link for that. You need to create an account there, and that's where you actually apply. So if you think you're competitive, that's where you would go and make the application. Now, if you think you're competitive, here's some other things to think about on ways I think you can become more competitive. Again, this is a limited number of positions that are available. And I do think we are approaching somewhat of maybe a retirement cliff. It's really hard to say, but a lot of the examiners that I see out there, just anecdotally, they're retired from the airlines. They're getting up there in age. I don't know how much longer they're going to be giving exams. So, I think now is a great time for people that meet the qualifications to start preparing and getting an application in. My application sat, I think, at Oklahoma City for about 4 years before I was designated. So it can take some time before you're designated. So let's talk about some things I think you can do to, one, get acquainted with the FAA and then help build that resume. The first one is get involved with the FAA safety team. So the FAAsafety.gov is the website that's home to the FAA safety team and the Wings Pilot Proficiency Program. That's a free pilot proficiency program sponsored by the FAA. Being involved with that is really important, at least for my FSDO. They require us examiners to be involved and be current in a phase of Wings and give out Wings credit. If you've never heard of that website, you need to get familiar with that. And you probably need to even volunteer to be a FAST team representative. And that's where you can give, free safety seminars, stuff like that. And they happen all over the country. In fact, I was just up in Phoenix, and I believe at Scottsdale Executive, there was a FAA seminar, a Wings safety seminar, I think last week.
We see them all the time.
Yeah, they're great. Sometimes they give, tours of TRACON facilities or tower facilities. You might have people that are doing like 4 flight demos. There's a lot of ways that you can take your expertise that you've gained in your career and kind of pay it forward and help build that safety culture with the FAA safety team. And that's really what the FAA is wanting to see is you've got this pattern of compliance and you're genuinely interested in aviation safety versus just, hey, I'm a 30,000 hour airline pilot. I know everything, make me a DPE. Well, that applicant might not be as strong as somebody who maybe goes and gives instruction on the weekends, volunteers for these safety seminars, doesn't have nearly as many hours, but is more connected to that general aviation kind of safety culture. They would be a lot stronger applicant than somebody that's just focused on their airline career or their corporate aviation career.
Makes sense. Okay. Anything else you can do? Any keywords in your application? What else you got?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's, every FSDO gets to decide how they do the hiring process. And another thing, because I know some airline guys might be listening and they're like, well, I don't have any connection to general aviation at all anymore. I don't own an airplane. I'm not a member of the Aero Club. A great way to get back involved with GA and kind of pay it forward is through the Civil Air Patrol. So the Civil Air Patrol is a great avenue for people to volunteer, experienced pilots especially. You get to work with youth that are interested in aviation. They've got a great aerospace program. They also have a large fleet of Cessna 182s you can get quote-unquote qualified in, go fly 182s on search and rescue exercises. So it's a great way to volunteer, great way to get reacquainted with general aviation. If you are sitting back thinking, hey, I'd be interested in doing this, but I don't have a clear path to get involved in general aviation, I think the Civil Air Patrol combined with the FAST team, those are two really great programs that you can volunteer for. They kind of really will help build that well-rounded resume rather than just being a really high-time, jet pilot, which doesn't necessarily make you a great candidate to be a examiner. So combine those two organizations with the responsibility of, being a check airman or a chief pilot, something like that. I think that gives you a really well-rounded resume that will look good to the FAA. It'll also give you those, there needs to be some networking that happens here. I hate it when people say it's a good old boys program, because it's just not. Let's say you're FSDO. Let's say Billy Bob at your local FSDO really likes his old friend Roy and wants to make him a DPE. He can't go out and make him a DPE, right? His friend has to apply through DMS. That goes to headquarters in Oklahoma City. Headquarters vets his application, and when the local FSDO wants an applicant, they tell Oklahoma City, hey, we need to hire a DPE. Here's the type of exams they need to be qualified for. So Oak City goes into the pool of qualified DPEs, and they send them kind of the top of the stack, I think, 6 or a dozen, applications, and the FSDO has to choose from one of those. So your job is to make sure your application is near the top on qualified candidates. And that's based on time your application has been there, and then these other things that we've been talking about. But the local FSDOs cannot go out and specifically hire a DPE. So the networking will help insofar as when you show up, when you finally get selected, we'll do a face-to-face interview. And so you might have already had interactions with these people at FAST team seminars or whatever other capacity you've been working with the FAA in. So that does help. When I sat down for my interview, I knew a couple of the people that were interviewing me from working as a FAST team representative and giving seminars there. So that did help. I call that just networking. That's simple networking. It took a lot of work. It takes sacrifice and volunteering. It's not a good old boy system. That leads people to think that, people who aren't worthy or not, not properly qualified are getting the job over people who are more qualified.
And then let's say you get all the stars align, you're on the top of the stack, goes to the FSDO. They're interviewing you. Are there like practical tests that you're doing? Is this more of like a document review? Like what's the process of the actual interview?
Yeah, so that's a good question here. So the process is you make the application in DMS. It sits at Oklahoma City. The FSDO decides to hire people. Your application goes to the FSDO. They'll filter that in, and they may pick half the people to do in-person interviews. So that's kind of phase 2. The in-person interview is a lot like an airline interview. It's face-to-face. You've got maybe 3 people across the table from you, and they're asking you questions that are related to your aviation background, maybe your theory on evaluation. They'll ask about some of your past experience as an evaluator and instructor. They will review the applicants that you've sent for a check ride. So like you need to have endorsed people to go take check rides as an instructor, so they may review some of that.
Ooh, pull the skeletons out of
where
your closet.
Where do you find those records, dude? After like a long time.
Well, they have them all. They're all in IACRA if they've been recent. Now, if they're way in the past, they still should have documentation through the 8710 that you signed off going to the applicant. So they'll be able to pull all that information.
Wow.
So they'll ask you questions like that. Then it's like, okay, do we think this person meets our needs? Is it someone we can work with? And they'll say, okay, we want to proceed to the next step. That's when you get in an airplane with an ASI and you're going to do a flight test, basically a check ride with them. And it can be in a single or multi, kind of whatever you're looking to be designated as. The ASI will pretend to be a student, make some common student errors. They'll let you fly the airplane, of course, make sure you're able to meet standards. If that goes well, they'll say, hey, we'd like to offer you a designation.
Wait, I have a question. Whose airplane is this? Like, do you rent an airplane?
Yeah, you have to find your own airplane. And a lot of times they'll want to ramp inspect that airplane. So that airplane owner needs to make sure it's a good airplane. Documents are all good to go because that is going to get a pretty tight inspection from the FAA. But yeah, once you do the flight test, they designate you. Then you have to book a course at Oklahoma City. You go there for about a week. Now, I did mine pre-COVID. I think now this might all be virtual, but I'm not sure. But in any case, it doesn't matter. The course is about a week long, and you learn how to develop plans of action. You learn how to give a checkride in accordance with the ACS standards. It's just a standardization week to make sure DPEs are as standard as possible. You'll go do that course, and then you come back, and the last step is you're going to give a live checkride to a real applicant with the FAA sitting in and observing. So that's your observation checkride.
Poor applicant.
So that's the last step. Once you, once you're done with the observation, they sit in on the ground and the flight. So they're going to sit in the room while you give the oral exam. Then they're going to sit in the back of the airplane when you give the flight exam.
Oh my goodness.
Poor student. They got to be losing it.
Do they have to pay for that too?
Yeah.
They're still paying too, right?
No. So that's kind of up to the examiner. You have to do an observation about once a year. If you're a real high activity, you might do an observation every 6 months. So I just did mine a couple of weeks ago. I had to do 2 basically because the first one ended in a disapproval. We didn't make it to the flight, unfortunately.
Oh.
The second one was just the flight, but I don't charge. Whenever the Fed is sitting in the plane or sitting in the room, I don't charge for that check ride. So, because it is a lot of added stress to the applicant.
Great. Yeah, that seems like it makes sense. You got to throw the kid a bone.
One little detail.
Yeah. Oh, just one more thing in the end of the brief. I forgot to mention this.
In this corner.
If you're a student listening to this podcast and you think you've had a windfall because your DPE reached out and said, hey, there's not going to be a fee for next week's check ride, that could mean that the feds are going to be sitting in on that. So,
just FYI.
Just FYI.
Poor kids.
Oh, man.
Especially somebody that, because there's different levels of check ride anxiety that people have.
Yeah.
And if you're one of the, have you just had anybody just, have a meltdown? It's just I can't do this.
I really try to put, the applicants at ease. But yeah, people, you might remember your first check rides, and even now it's a little bit of, there's a little bit of added stress. So yeah, I've had applicants have a really hard time, and it's like, okay, this isn't a hostage situation. I can't hurt you. Even if this check ride doesn't go well, it still doesn't mean you can't ever be a pilot again. Just, calm down.
Was it weird for you after giving all of these check rides and then being back into the student role for so long at initial training at the airline and then having to take a type ride and the whole thing?
Yeah, it was a little bit, that's a whole nother story. My 121 ride with Southwest did not go well. It's so funny because I've been given thousands of check rides, and then I go into that check ride and I was totally calm. It was all good.
Was your IACR all screwed up?
Yeah.
you remember your number?
Yeah.
How to log in?
No, that was fine, but it just went totally haywire, and it was like an out-of-body experience. I could see what I was doing wrong. I knew exactly what the examiner was probably seeing, and it just wasn't my best day. I had a bad day that day, but I still passed, so it's fine.
No way. That's kind of ironic, huh? I bet you just went after that shaking your head what? Yeah. What a world.
Let's take a quick break from our conversation with Seth to talk about a friend of ours. That friend, of course, is Timothy P. Pope. He's a certified financial planner dedicated to guiding professional pilots through smart financial planning. Whether it's saving for retirement, investment management, a seamless military transition, or strategic tax planning, Tim is your trusted financial partner. Join Tim as he leads engaging discussions on personal finance strategies for professional pilots on the Pilot Money podcast, which Max and I were just on. You can go track down the episode where we are featured. Timothy P. Pope, helping professional pilots make the most out of life. All right, back to our conversation with Seth. Okay, so let's say you pass all of this, you're actually online. Give us the nuts and bolts of what does it actually look like to be a DPE? And how do you schedule it? What's the pipeline? Do you have to advertise?
Is there a minimum amount of check rides?
Yeah, how does this all work to actually run the business?
How do you set the fees?
Yeah, all that.
So it is a business for sure. There are examiners that do this as a full-time job. I decided not to go that route because you are essentially an independent contractor. You're self-employed. So I started an LLC. I run everything through an LLC. That's pretty common for DPEs to do. There's no benefits to the job. And I gave kind of a price breakdown on a rather long post on Reddit that maybe I can send y'all to there. But we kind of break down the hourly of what you're actually making as a DPE. So even with, an $800 or $900 fee for a check ride, if you break down the hours and the number of cancellations that I deal with every year, it works out to be around $150 to $160 an hour, which that's just in this industry, weirdly enough, that's just not a lot of money compared to what you can make as a major airline pilot, So now that may come off, wrong there. I don't want to sound like I'm a money hungry person, but
no, it's just reality. And the audience here at least understands that. Because it's not 8 hours a day. You're making $150 an hour,
correct?
Right? It's
correct.
Your time invested, which we all are acutely aware of.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So from the outside looking in, it may seem like, oh, you can just make boatloads of money as an examiner. And that hasn't been my experience. You can make really good money, but it is a lot of responsibility and a lot of management. So if you're going to make a lot of money, you need a good system in place, for billing and scheduling, or you need to be able to make deals with large flight schools. There's kind of two ways you can go out and schedule check rides. You can do all independent check rides. So you can, I'm sitting in my office in Russellville right now in Arkansas. People fly to me to do check rides. So that's one option. I use a product called Calendly that a lot of, independent professionals use, and I'll make my schedule live and anybody can go on there and apply for a check ride. It books them and they show up and do the check ride. That's difficult in its own way because every single check ride you're dealing with a new applicant, but also a new airplane. And that's kind of a bigger deal because there's more than a few examiners that have been, kind of died in the line of duty, as it were, in aircraft accidents. So the airworthiness of that airplane is a big concern of mine. So doing the independent method of having people fly to me, I've been presented with more than a few airplanes that I'm just not comfortable flying. So that's kind of a challenge if you're going to do it that way. You can go out and reach out to these larger flight schools, and the process is a lot smoother. They'll generally reimburse you for, your travel down there, your hotel, rental car. They may give you a food stipend in some cases. They're trying to woo these examiners in because they have a really high check ride need. So they tend to throw a lot of incentives at you, and it makes your life a little bit easier. They typically have a better maintenance structure in my experience, and you're typically flying the same 3 or 4 kind of check ride airplanes is what I've noticed. Is they tend to have a couple of airplanes that they like their applicants to take check rides in. So you get more familiar with those airplane types and their maintenance history. So that's kind of the two big options. Work with a big flight school, do it that way, or work independently and just have people come to you.
So, you mentioned traveling in. That just kind of goes back. So if you're approved and you're designated, does that mean you can give check rides anywhere in the United States, or is it just in your FSDO region?
Prior to 2019, you could only do it in your region. But after 2019, the FAA changed a couple rules. They removed the regional restriction. So now you can give check rides anywhere.
Cool.
Even in foreign countries. So I've got a friend that travels to Japan, and he gives check rides in Japan to U.S. citizens at an Air Force flying club there. So you can travel anywhere as long as you're flying an N-numbered airplane, so a FAA registered airplane, and you're giving tests to a U.S. citizen when you're in a foreign country. But anyway, you can give them federally anywhere in the country. The rule is you have to give the FAA 24 hours notice that you're doing a practical test. You have to give them a street address where you're doing that check ride at. You can do a check ride with less than 24 hours notice, but you have to provide some sort of justification for that. So typically you book them at least 24 hours in advance, tell them a street address. That way the FAA, if they want to, they can show up and kind of give you a no-notice observation. They have to be able to do that. But typically I book people out a couple weeks in advance. I'll put all of these in the DMS system to let the FAA know what check rides I'm doing. And then I show up, and you can do up to 3 exams per day. It doesn't matter if it's commercial, private, instrument, whatever, you can do 3 of those. That differs though with like a CFI initial. A CFI initial is kind of its own check ride beast. It takes a really long time. So they used to have a rule that said you can only give a CFI check ride and then nothing else. I don't think that is still in effect, but you just physically can't give that many check rides when you're doing a CFI initial. So I'll typically do a CFI initial and then maybe like a double I add-on that day, but you can't give really much more than 1 check ride a day when you're doing those.
Yeah, I remember hearing stories of the CFI initials, and it's basically like an all-day event.
Yeah,
for
a lot of
folks.
teaching going.
Is it still one of the highest failure rate check rides at CFI initial?
I think it's a pretty high failure rate. Yeah. I don't actually keep stats for me personally. I don't know, but I think I'm right within kind of the standard deviation of where everybody else is at. I think it's higher than 50%, but it's like in the 70% range, I think.
Yeah. It's a real deal. It's a challenge. It's a challenging one. Okay, Seth. So I think kind of what you've talked to now is sort of the professionals that are interested in maybe doing this. Any other thoughts or things that people should know about if they're considering this? You kind of mentioned you're running your own business and you're a contractor. Anything else we need to know?
Some other questions you might have are, does this affect my flying hours for my 121 job, right? Because a lot of us that are in 121 or another professional setting, the FAA limits us to how many hours we can fly per year. So if you're out there on a side gig and you're using up some of that time, that could affect your primary employment. The FAA has standing regulations on this that say as long as you're conducting the check ride in an aircraft that doesn't require you to serve as a crew member, then that time does not count towards your commercial flying activity. So this doesn't count towards your FAR limitations when it comes to hourly flying for anything, as long as you're not sitting in the seat of basically a crewed aircraft. So like a 172, that's a single pilot aircraft. When you're sitting in the right seat of 172, that's not counting towards your commercial time. The exception to that is if you were going to go out and give a check ride in a Lear, for instance, or a Citation.
Or a C-130, perhaps.
Yeah, or a C-130. So that's a 2-pilot certified airplane, and you're sitting in the right seat conducting the exam. That does count towards commercial flying. So you would have to report that to your airline or however you're tracking that. Different airlines have different rules on, generally speaking, though, you're going to need to let the chief pilot know, hey, this is the type of outside flying activity that I'm doing. And, know that you're not given the same protections that you have when you're flying with your airline. You're out there, you may not carry a little bit different life insurance rider because I'm doing general aviation. So, if your life insurance stuff, and this is maybe too in the weeds, but I think it's important. If your life insurance as an airline pilot covers commercial flying, it may not cover general aviation flying. So that may be something you want to look into to make sure you're properly insured there.
That was another question I kind of had as far as like your responsibility as a DPE for those applicants that you sign off. You're basically, saying that they meet the standard and can exercise the privileges of whatever certificate, right? So what's the liability implications for you as a DPE if one of the people you grant a commercial pilot certificate to then goes to fly their Grand Canyon tour in a 206 and crashes and kills a bunch of people? Can that stuff ever come back to you to say, hey, well, they signed him off? Is there liability implication? Do you have to carry insurance to cover that? And the reason I asked this is I flew with a guy that was a DPE, and we were talking about the fact that it's very difficult to get a check ride in a tailwheel airplane because if the higher probability of somebody ground looping and creating an incident or accident, right? If the people you sign off, he was explaining to me that if you sign off 100 private pilot people and 20 of them ground loop in a tailwheel, they can come back and be like, well, look, this is not an appropriate ratio and pull your examining authority. So that's kind of where I started thinking about this.
That brings up a couple of good points. So one is, what are your protections as a DPE? And essentially there are none. Like there's a pilot's bill of rights. There's not a DPE bill of rights. So we have no contract, and the FAA has no obligation to us as examiners. So the FAA could say, Seth, we really don't like you being on the 21.5 podcast, we don't think that was appropriate. Hand us your designation.
I mean, that's almost a near certainty, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm glad I'm at Southwest now because I have a good backup.
Yeah.
But anyway, the FAA can pull your designation for any reason. And that's definitely, they can pull it with cause or without cause. So with cause would be, well, we're going to pull your designation because 10% of your applicants have had incidents within a month of you giving them their certificate. So I have unfortunately had a couple of applicants that I've given check rides to have fatal accidents. And I've been involved in the investigation in those instances. Fortunately, it's just 2 instances. In both of those cases, I wasn't found as a contributing factor to that accident. Basically, the FAA and NTSB decided that it wasn't my lack of evaluation or failure as an examiner that was directly, attributed to those applicants having an accident later on. But there was a lot of time in between those 2 accidents. So not to get into any, specific details, but if you have an applicant that you gave a check ride to and like 5 years later they have a fatal accident, I doubt you'll even be part of the investigation process. But if it's within a year, they might look and you might have to talk on the phone with the NTSB investigator and they might say, hey, did you notice any problems during the check ride, or, ask some questions like that. And in one of my cases, the applicant I had failed him on the private pilot check ride the first go around. And then the second go around, he met standards and passed. And then about a year later, he crashed in an airplane that was different than the one that I gave him the check ride in. And that was a big contributing factor to that one. It's a lot of responsibility. You don't have any guarantees from the FAA. That's one of the reasons why I chose to seek out kind of an airline career or something that's at least more stable, because the FAA doesn't give me any benefits. They don't give me insurance. There's no disability, none of that. So you have to kind of build your own safety net. I'm sure an examiner could go out there and pay for their own disability insurance and loss of medical insurance and all of that. But again, you're only making about $150 an hour. So at some point, it's not worth it. You've got this huge amount of responsibility, and you could make so much more money as an airline pilot with so much less responsibility with a lot more benefits. Have I talked many people into being a DPE?
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, you've
you know what? Great side gig. Sounds like a great, well, it is, but that's really what it kind of amounts to. Is like the
side gig.
Being able to, that's the great part of being an airline pilot too, is that you have a lot of time on your hands.
And I think the other thing is like you mentioned before, I would imagine most DPEs have some motivation to be giving back to the aviation community, right? I mean, that's got to be part of your motivation, isn't it?
Oh, sure. It's fun. I enjoy getting to interact with like these 18-year-old kids who are excited about aviation.
Right.
And they want to get into the industry. And so being part of their aviation journey is a lot of fun. I get bored easily, so keeping that diverse flying experience is a lot of fun. I think it makes me a more well-rounded pilot because, I was in Phoenix giving check rides last week, and I was giving a lot of CFII rides. So I fly a lot during the CFII. So I'm flying raw data approaches, making stupid mistakes to see if the CFI applicant's going to correct me. And I'm having a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm giving an evaluation, but I'm also getting to fly, and it kind of mixes things up from flying the 737 day in and day out where you're, it's very standardized and may get a little monotonous. So it's a good way to mix it up, good way to stay involved with GA and kind of give back to the community.
Okay. As exciting as flying the ILS to 30 left in San Jose is for the 9,000th time. I see your point. Yeah.
After landing checklist. Okay. Let's shift gears for a minute. We may have some student pilot listeners that are listening. You have done, I would say, literally thousands of check rides at this point?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know exactly how many. I should probably keep better track. I'm sure the FAA knows.
Yeah, somebody knows.
To query the 8710 database that we were discussing. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So we're going to do this TikTok style. If you have kids that watch TikTok, you'll see these dumb videos where they go, what's a green flag? What's a red flag? That's like the only question they ask. It's kind of silly. But I actually think it might be interesting for this. So when you're meeting with an applicant for the first time, what is something that you notice, green flag that you see and you're like, oh, this person's prepared, or I think this person, it seems like they're on the right track. What's that first thing that you notice?
So a well-prepared applicant will have some sort of checkride folder usually prepared, and it has all of their government photo ID, their pilot certificate, their medical, maybe the aircraft logbooks. They have their pilot logbook that's tabbed out with the appropriate sections. A digital logbook is a great thing to have because it speeds up that application process. They've got the aircraft logbooks that are tabbed out, proving that the aircraft is airworthy. Basically, they're like over prepared for the check ride. That's a great green flag, and it makes the application process go so smoothly. And there's a lot of check rides that I contribute the people failing to them showing up unprepared, and it takes me just an hour to even start the check ride. And that just amps up the stress when I'm sitting there quietly digging through this just mess of documentation to figure out, is this applicant qualified and is the plane legal for me to fly? If I don't know that very easily, I've got to find that out before I start the test. And they're just sitting there sweating bullets the whole time. And, it is just it comes with the territory for me. I'm not too concerned about it, but for them, they're like, oh, Seth's going to be super angry because I'm just not organized. And
what was the dimensions of Class C airspace?
Yeah. So showing up, over prepared, that's great. I love to see that. In my podcast, I kind of talk about some tips and tricks you can use to get prepared for that check ride if you're going to one. Knowing the airman certification standards, that's a big one. If somebody's never heard of the ACS and they're going to take a check ride, I just kind of shake my head because that's literally the check ride. That's like the math teacher posting the final exam on the first day of class, that you've had that from day one. So knowing that document or not knowing that document, that'd be a huge green flag or red flag.
Okay. So yeah, the red flag sounds like it's basically just the opposite. Unprepared, paperwork's not organized. Any wardrobe recommendations? This is a big factor. Do you have to wear a tie?
I hate to be that guy, but business professional, just look nice.
Something with a collar,
good.
Right?
Yeah.
Start there.
I think a polo shirt is perfectly reasonable. Now, if you show up in t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops, first I'm going to ask, hey, you're not going to fly the airplane in those, right? The flip-flops, that is. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to fail you. I'm not going to fail you because you didn't dress professionally. But my perception of you as not taking this seriously, is going to have some sort of effect on how the check ride goes. So just be careful. I would dress as professional as possible. I try to do the same. I always wear a collared shirt. I wear slacks. I'm not like dressed to the nine or anything, but it's a profession. Early on in my flight training, I had an old Marine instructor in my flight training, and he's like, Lieutenant Lake, is flying a science or an art? And I was like, and he's like, it's a profession. And that just stuck with me for some reason. So
that's really good.
Yeah.
I'm surprised the FAA doesn't mandate that you wear pleated khaki Dockers and boat shoes and your identification on a long lanyard that swings around like a pendulum.
Oh, yeah. You got to have the lanyard. You got to have the lanyard.
I actually got ramp checked one time in Opelika by a dude dressed just like that. I think that's why it's so ingrained in my mind. That's what an FAA representative looks like.
It's the lanyard, though, right?
I remember him walking up in this, and I was like, I'm like, this is the FAA.
Here it comes.
He walks up and he goes, hey, my name's Greg Brown. I'm with the FAA. And I'm like, are you here to help?
Did you say that?
I did. I totally said that. And he laughed. He was cool. He's like, that's a good one. No, I'm here to do a ramp inspection. I said, perfect.
Yep.
I said, we've been preparing our whole lives for this. Because we had a SAFA book, right? Which is like way more in depth. So we pull out the SAFA book. I'm like, would you like a copy of the registration or just to see it?
See, you were prepared.
Yeah, I was prepared. We were over prepared. It was awesome.
That's what Seth says. So, Seth, you mentioned you have a podcast. You go in great detail about how to be prepared, tips for success on check rides. And so we'll encourage our listeners to check that out. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Any parting thoughts for us? Any good stories?
Yeah, there's got to be a good story. What's the verbiage that it was? That the outcome of the maneuver was never seriously in doubt?
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, exactly. There's so many good check ride stories. This one, real quick, he didn't fail. He wound up passing, but he did one of the most hilarious things during the check ride that I've ever seen. And we were sitting on the ramp. He had just started the engine, and it was during the summer. It was on a 172, so he had that window open. And he was a private pilot applicant, super nervous kid. Felt terrible for him. He was just sweating bullets the whole time. But he did well during the oral. We go out to the airplane, does a great pre-flight, gets in the plane, starts the engine, and he's got his arm hanging out the door. He's looking really confused at the windsock and then listening into the ATIS over and over and over again. And finally, he makes a radio call, and I could tell, you could see his wheels turning in his brain, like he's trying to make a really difficult decision, and I just have no idea what he's confused about. But he finally makes a radio call, and he's going to taxi to the runway that would give us a pretty clear tailwind from both the ATIS and the windsock. So we taxi to this wrong runway, and I'm thinking to myself, man, please catch this, because if you decide to do the takeoff now, I'm going to have to issue a disapproval because this is clearly not the correct runway. Well, luckily for him, as we're taxiing to the incorrect runway, somebody or two people enter the pattern and land on the correct runway. So now he looks really confused. He turns around, goes to the other runway. We take off. He does a great check ride. Well, I later found out that his arm out the window, he was feeling the propeller blast.
And every direction I turned was a headwind.
Instead of trusting the ATIS and the windsock, he thought the wind was coming from where the propeller blast was coming.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
It's just funny. Like, taking a check ride is such a weird thing, because I remember, too, sometimes you do stuff, you're like, what was I thinking? Like, I know better than that. Like, what? But yeah, it's also so painful sitting there. I'll never forget sitting there and just watching people go down this road, towards failure. And you're just like, oh, please, dude. And they're just, sometimes people are just completely oblivious. They're just like, oh, yeah. And they're just completely flying away from the diversion airport. And you're just like, dude, like, what are we doing? Where are we? Like, and you're diverting to Payson. You start coming up on Phoenix, and you're like,
where are we going?
So, do you, Payson's grown quite a bit, huh?
Wow. Oh, man. That's a pretty good one.
And you give it a head, they're like, oh, wow, yeah, it has. Yeah. No, bro, come on.
People get in their head, and they'll make some of the silliest mistakes. And
it's crazy.
And I talked to him in the debrief. I'm like, I really think you would have never made that mistake. You were just, I could tell you're over there. You're overanalyzing everything. And, you just make some really silly mistakes. So,
and we all have bad days, and it's okay.
Yeah.
If you make a mistake on a check ride, it's not a big deal. I failed a check ride for a diversion. So,
happens. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And failures happen.
I didn't
too,
give you that one, did I? That's funny. What a gig.
Seth, we encourage folks to check out your show. Do you have a LinkedIn that we can link to as well if folks want to get more information from you?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn, just Seth Lake. I'm on Instagram, VSL Aviation on Instagram and Facebook. Look me up there. Website, vsl.aero, has a lot of information. So, yeah, anybody DPE specific stuff, shoot me an email and we can talk.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Seth. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. I love your show, so it's an honor to be on it. And I'm excited.
We appreciate it, man.
Thank you. Just don't let the FSDO know that you were on the show, right? So with
yeah.
All right, guys. How good was that? Really interesting conversation with Seth. Did you like this show? What'd you think of the conversation? Are you going to be applying to be a DPE? Hit us up, info@215podcast.com. Let us know if you've got any thoughts about the interview, or if you want to hit us up for the mailbag or send in something for flight advice. We will be back next week covering all of your questions and emails.
Here we go.
Thanks so much to our sponsors who make this show possible: Timothy P. Pope, Harvey Watt, Advanced Aircrew Academy, Veris Jet Sales, and the Air Comp Calculator. We'll be back next week. And until then, remember, flexibility is the key to air power. The statements made in this show are our own opinions and do not reflect, nor were they under any direction from any of our employers.